Hello, and welcome to our webinar and panel discussion on cyber resiliency and data recovery, safeguarding your organization in 2024. My name is Heather Rowney. I handle the marketing operations here at the IT Executive Council, and I'm really excited to be a part of this awesome webinar today. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to give a quick agenda, and I'm going to go over some brief housekeeping items as well. And then after that, we'll just dive right in, and you'll hear about some real-life examples of organizations that have experienced some security breaches. Each of the panelists are going to offer their insights and commentary on each of those. And then if we still have some time, we do have some additional data resiliency strategies and concepts that we may be able to cover, along with some key data recovery essentials that you may need to consider when an attack potentially does happen. Finally, we will leave some time at the end to do an audience Q&A. So feel free to submit your questions at any time using the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. So now quickly for those housekeeping items, I also did want to mention that this webinar is being recorded. You will receive a copy of that along with the presentation in about 24 hours from now. And if you have any issues during the webinar, please feel free to reach out via the chat function. So with that, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists, who you can also see here as well. So first up, we have Christos Tulumba, who's the Chief Information Security Officer at Veritas, which is the leader in data management. He's a seasoned cybersecurity professional with over 2 decades of hands-on experience. He's navigated a diverse career path from the trenches of security analysis and engineering. And then we have Roger Dombrowski, who's a backup and recovery subject matter expert at VAST, who is a national IT services and infrastructure management firm. He has deep knowledge in data protection strategies for disaster recovery, and he helps design, configure, and implement data protection systems using industry-leading backup and recovery products. So thank you both for joining us today, and I can't wait to hear your perspective on these case studies and these organizations and how they should be protecting themselves. So with that, we're going to jump right in. We have 3 case studies that we're going to cover. So essentially real life incidents that the panelists are going to talk through. So just kind of quickly highlight those 3 here. And so let's dive right into the first one.
Great. Thank you, Heather. Excuse me. So the first case study, we're going to talk about a financial technical company that got owned. So last year, a fintech company suffered a significant ransomware attack. The attack didn't originate from common vectors like phishing or credential theft. In this case, the attackers exploited an unpatched remote code execution vulnerability in the VPN software. The vulnerability allowed them to gain initial access into the firm's network relatively easy. Once they were inside the network, the attackers leveraged the lack of segmentation and internal security controls to move laterally. They identified and targeted critical financial and customer data servers, and within hours, they deployed ransomware across all of these systems. They encrypted all vital data, left the ransom note demanding payment in cryptocurrency for the decryption key. The fintech attempted to recover, but hit several complications during the recovery process. The first one was the lack of defined RTOs. The fintech never established recovery time objectives, which led to a ton of confusion and delays in the recovery process. There was no clear understanding or plan on how quickly these systems, on how quickly systems and data needed to be restored to minimize operational impact. Roger?
Yeah, thanks, Christos, for setting that up. Yeah, so, we're going to talk about a lot of acronyms here. RTO, you'll hear that. That means recovery time option, and that essentially is dictating how long it's going to take to bring that workload up. And it sounded to me like maybe the backup solution might have been neglected a little bit. Things need to be architected differently for things that need very tight or low or short recovery time objectives. We're not going to apply all the same tools we have to very critical workloads. What can really help in this situation is understanding your data, understanding the criticality of it, the sensitivity of it. I can just feel and sense the attitude in the room. Hey, my stuff needs to go first. Why is this taking so long? And things that are going to help the situation immensely, especially for virtualized workloads, is a feature that a lot of the backup solutions are adopting called instant recovery. Virtualization teams basically can point their compute infrastructure at the backup data, at the backup disk drives. We can actually run the virtual machines and run the machines off the backup storage. We've seen some great improvements in this feature set, almost to the point where you could literally say instant master stores really become a reality. And I think it's something that probably should have been addressed in this situation, should have been looked at. And that's usually the sign of somebody who's kind of content where they are. Maybe not, you're not looking at things, looking to make the world a better place. And I think just as important as recovery time options are, and we didn't really mention it in the setup of what happened in this case, was recovery point options, or you might hear RPO. But this concept is vitally critical. It sometimes means, sometimes even losing an hour's worth of data can be extremely disastrous. So shortening and tightening up those RPOs may mean more frequent backups, and that tends to, impact production workloads altogether. So we really need to lean on tools. Primary storage snapshots are a good way to kind of get things done quickly and more frequently. Of technology that's been around for a little while, and there's some point products that do it, is something we call continuous data protection. And I'm seeing the big vendors are starting to bake that feature in. And basically what continuous data protection, or CDP, is going to do for you is fork off IOs and blocks, and changes that are going to primary storage are going to get redirected over to a journaling system. So what that's going to allow you to achieve is, sub-minute, up to sub-minute kind of recovery point options if that need is, that critical need is needed there. It's the deep end of the pool. It's going to be complex. It's going to be a little bit of cost, but it's certainly one of the tools in our tool bag that we can bring to a problem like this where things aren't getting recovered fast enough. Christos, there were some other things that came up.
Absolutely. One of the other issues that they really have was duplicate data and system sprawl, right? Not being adequately prepared, understanding where your data resides, where your critical systems are, makes recovery that much harder, right? Getting prepared for an event in advance is absolutely critical and crucial. It's one of those things that no tech team really wants to focus on, but in crunch time becomes unbelievably important, right? It's just to stay organized, knowing where your data sits, making sure that you can restore that and get back operational in the time that you need to hit is one of the most critical things you could do, and it's often overlooked. It should be part of your annual playbook to go through, test, restore, recover, understand your critical systems and workloads.
Yep. And as soon as I heard sprawl and confusion, my first thoughts immediately turned to, data insight and visibility tools, not necessarily part of backup and recovery tools, what I deal with every day, but there are tools out there. And NIST, actually, and you'll hear that term, that acronym a lot, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. They have a framework for cyber resiliency framework. And one of their big tenets of that is, reducing the attack exposure, right? Having multiple copies of data intentionally for redundancy is great. Having multiple copies of data that's sprawling about that are not getting handled and protected correctly are going to open you up to, increase that attack vector and that exposure. And Christos, I don't know what you're hearing or seeing, but what I've been kind of hearing around cybercrime these days is it used to be come in, encrypt the data, hold your hand out with the ransomware, with the ransom note, and give me money. Now it's data exfiltration. They're subverting, they're quiet, they're sneaking around, they're in the environment for a while, and they're pulling data out of your environment if they can. So how bad is that? Not only is your production potentially down, but you could have important PII data out on the dark web. So really getting a handle on where your data is, where the sensitive data is key and critical, like Christos says. And if you want to do yourself a favor, look up dark data discovery and compliance tools. I think those things will definitely bring to bear things to scan to find where the redundant, where the obsolete, where the trivial, we call that rot data, to clean it up. It could save you money on primary storage, and it can really save your bacon with minimizing that attack that attack footprint. there were some other things that this customer hit upon too, wasn't it, Christos?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the data point, right? Attackers, they're very sophisticated these days. These are large organizations that really understand how to make an impact and how to really impact an organization. The one thing that I'm starting to see is they do their homework on you. They know what regulatory requirements or what privacy requirements your company faces, and they know that if they exfiltrate, X amount of data, you're going to be fined and fined tremendously. They also know how much your cyber insurance policies cover these days, and they ask for the maximum, right? They're very sophisticated. This isn't, ransomware 5-6 years ago where, they would just deploy some malware and request $200 in Bitcoin. This is a different world. It's very sophisticated. There's big money and big dollars fueling this. Making sure that you know where that data resides and being aware of exfiltration points, it can severely limit the financial loss and operational disruption. And then that'll maintain your reputation, your integrity as a company. One of the other lessons, and especially in this case, when we think about their entry point, we're going back to basics here. They got in because of an unpatched VPN node that was, subject to a remote code execution vulnerability. Making sure that you have a patch management program in place and your systems are regularly updated is so unbelievably crucial to maintaining your security. And I don't want to say it's overlooked, but you have to be very, very diligent when it comes to that. And the other one is, we keep going back to this, is proper incident response planning. Think about the scenarios that your organization is susceptible to. Plan for those. You need to think about, and it makes me cringe saying this statement, but when people say it's not if but when, I cannot stand that statement, but it's the reality. It really is, right?
Yeah.
And being prepared for the if, when the time comes, makes that situation much easier for you.
Yeah, you made a point, and I remember when we were going over these cases that in this particular case, although the backups were being performed, the team hadn't really tested the restore process under crisis, and the backups weren't current and weren't behaving, and they believed that there was critical data missing. And the minute I hear that, the first thing I'm thinking of is rewinding to the old days in my career when backup and recovery was really just an insurance policy. People spent sometimes a lot of money and really didn't get a whole lot of little or no return from that in terms of the bottom line to the business. But with cybercrime today, and I think Christos can back me up on this, it's a critical part of cost avoidance. You don't want to pay that ransom. You want to lower your cyber insurance because the cyber insurance companies are asking more of us all the time. And then obviously you want to minimize or eliminate the losses due to the downtime. It sounds like this customer got kind of sideways on that. Some of the things that I think the backup admins and leadership should really be thinking about or pondering or bring in front of mind are, it's easy to say, are the backups successful? I think if you'd be negligent if you couldn't tell the enterprise like, hey, our backups are generally, pretty successful. It's a different thing, and you touched on that, is the backup solution healthy? Are we staying current with patches? That's going to close off a lot of things, and it's also going to bring, fruits of what the vendors, the new tools they're bringing to the table to help solve some of these problems. And something that used to keep me up at night a lot more back with physical discrete servers was, are we backing everything up? You know what you're backing up, what aren't you backing up, what are we exposed to? But now with modern virtualization tools and all the backup vendors are communicating well with that, we can see workloads that aren't protected. Just a note that I would say to people who are using auto protection kind of tools is just be careful about, what those tools are doing and how they're, what policies those backups might be winding up in. We talk a little bit, this was the case we're talking about RTOs and RPOs, and you got a workload that somebody spun up and it's critical, but it wound up in a policy that wasn't getting backed up to meet your RTOs and RPOs. So those are all real important things just to kind of keep a close eye on what's going on there. And another thing that I think this case, especially this last point here about being a little overwhelmed, kind of brings to light, and it's a nice trend. It's a good thing I'm seeing in the marketplace with the backup solutions are building in cyber resiliency planning, testing, and orchestration. Now, different products are at different levels of maturation with those feature sets, but before it just used to be I'm backing up and I'm recovering. Now, there are various levels of sophistication with policies I can create. I can create a plan. I can say, hey, this workload needs to come up first, then this one, and that one's coming from this source, and this one's coming from that source. And the more sophisticated they get, the better you're able to actually practice and rehearse these recoveries, integrating with your network team and being able to, what I call, stand up a bubble, so to speak, so that you can, in real time, bring up these workloads, test them, run them, isolated from your regular production environment, because that was kind of always the big thing, right? We'd practice DRs and it meant a weekend of, sleepless nights because you were taking things down to try and test these. And we're getting to a point in the market and with the tools where we don't necessarily have to do that, And some of the best tools that I'm seeing now, it's pretty cool, are actually watching over your plan. If you've defined some, tight, recovery point RPOs where, hey, you have to do hourly backups and those hourly backups are slipping or not happening, the tool is going to notify you and say, hey, I'm not going to be able to meet the plan you defined, and you better address this issue. So a lot of cool innovation. I like what we're seeing in the marketplace. A theme through this is I think a lot of people are leaving some features on the table and not leveraging them, And Christos, so there was another point that I was looking at in this case too, was the resource constraints. The team was overwhelmed by the scale of the attack and struggled to coordinate. That again is going to get back to, orchestration and practicing. We're all being asked to do more with less. I don't know how, not too many IT guys that I run into are looking for something to do. They usually have, 30% more than what they can handle, But again, I'll turn back to the NIST, framework here. I'm the wrong guy to tell somebody to go dive into a lengthy government document, but I really found it somewhat eye-opening, and it isn't too daunting. It's not like a 1,000-page thing. There's some really good information in what I thought, and it really opened my eyes to, is not only is it kind of making you aware of the complexity, but it's also drawing you into, hey, I do need a tool for this. And it also is talking about people and processes too. This is going to be a team effort. I think we're going to see one of the other cases, it was pawned off on a group. And certainly even, and Christos was telling me offline here that the cyber insurance companies are going to insist other organizations and other authorities are going to come into play here while you're doing this. But it's still incumbent on us to get the data back, and then deal with all the other fallout after that. So that was kind of my 2 cents or 14 cents or $2 on that case. Christos, was there anything else we needed to cover on the impact or anything? Or
no, I think we got that one. Maybe we should move on to case study 2.
Okay.
Yeah, wow, that was very insightful, and certainly there was a lot that organization should have been doing. So yeah, let's take a look at the next one here.
Okay. So the next one is an interesting case, right? This started off, it seemed like, a traditional plain old ransomware attack, one of the ones that, we experience on a daily basis. So in this case, we're going to examine a consumer packaged good company, got hit with a strain of ransomware, and it resulted in a 10-day outage. In this case, the company chose not to pay the ransom, but to restore from backups. They were comfortable with their backup strategy. They had a pretty robust cybersecurity program in place. They did run simulations, and they were excuse me, and they were in a good spot, or so they thought. The difference here is, as they started to restore from backups, the backups did start to become successful. However, there was a time bomb in one of the backups, which resulted in another infection. So I'm going to walk you through the timeline of events, starting from day one. So the attack begun with a malicious email attachment opened by an employee. It allowed the ransomware to infiltrate the company's network. Once it was detonated, the ransomware was able to spread laterally and encrypted files and rendered a lot of the systems inaccessible. On the same day, the attackers they demanded a pretty large ransom in cryptocurrency for the decryption key. Pretty standard operating procedure for these ransomware groups. It took about a day or two for the companies to determine that what they thought was they were in a good position, and they said, you know what, we're not going to pay the ransom. We're going to opt to do a restore from our backups. We maintain clean backups. We don't think it's ethical to pay the ransom, and we don't believe it's legal either. So we're going to go and do the restore. So they spent the next, I think, 3 days, days 5 to 8, initiating the restore process from their backups, which is, for all of us that have been through, we know it's very time consuming, due to the size of the data affected. But during this period, the organization believed that they were on the path to recovery. On day 9, the restoration process was complete and they thought the incident was behind them. Unknowingly, a time bomb detonated in one of the files, and the malicious code started to spread again and cause another outage that led to additional disruption. At this point, we pretty much know that it's going to be another week or at least another week to go through restore. And then the other piece is they really had to figure out, where is this time bomb? How did they get to it? And how do they stop the recurrence from happening? So eventually, they went through their process and services were restored around the 20-day mark. In this case, though, there was a big lesson learned, right? They practiced, they did all the right things on paper, right? They practiced, they had, what they thought were clean backups. The one thing that they missed out on was restoring into an isolated recovery environment to ensure that the ransomware and malicious code wasn't reintroduced into the restored environment. Excuse me. Roger, do you want to walk them through how it could have been done a little bit better with a little more a little more white glove service in a recovery environment?
Sure. Thanks, Christos, for setting that one up. Yeah, there's really no huge leap of logic here. The backup solution backed up infected data, so we're going to have to figure out how to scrub it out. And this might be a good time, Heather, to get up to the drawing I have, because I think this is a good thing to talk through here. This is what Christos meant is that this is kind of architectural leveraging an IRE or isolated recovery environment. Thank you for the brain fade there. This is my public service message. It's obviously imperative that the primary storage where the data lives and breathes is where we really need the best place to look and isolate and squash the malware. But in this example, obviously that wasn't the case. The restore performance is it's gonna take a long time. This is and for restore performance, as you can see in this architecture, as I'm walking through it here over on the left-hand side, it usually makes the most sense to have that first backup be in close proximity to the machine or the workload that you're trying to recover. And when I mean close, I mean not offsite or someplace else where network speed or latency and things like that are going to impact your restore throughput. Unless of course you've made distinct plans that if something like this happens, we're bringing this all up someplace else. Then not now but you still want the backups close over there, right? So we're architecting for that. And as you can see in this case here, you've got your primary workloads. They're getting backed up to a local deduplication pool. Again, disk-based backups are going to be our friend here. I know tape is still around. We're still dealing with it, but and it's a great air-gapped portable solution, but there's a lot of downsides to it. So if you're still using tape, and hopefully that's like a third or a tertiary copy, if that's your primary copy, you're gonna be struggling a little bit here to get to handle what the cyber criminals are throwing at us here. Great setup for DR, but not adequate for cyber resiliency here. And we're going to learn a little bit in this session about the best isolated recovery environments and the best architectures are based on multiple copies being in multiple places. So yeah, some of my customers have built out what we call this cyber vault, or this isolated recovery environment, and different vendors and security experts will also refer to this as a clean room. I think those concepts there's a little Venn diagram going on there. There's a little bit of overlap, but both are critically necessary. And you kind of can tell from what's going on here, it would have saved them a lot of trouble had they had this set up. The best practices are ever and constantly evolving, but it needs to be built on purpose-built, dedicated, and isolated backup infrastructure. We need to leverage hardened OSs, zero trust architecture, immutable and indelible backup storage targets. Boy, that's a mouthful, but I think you're seeing it all in the diagram here. I can't stress that isolated piece enough too, because I've had a customer or two, and it's very easy and tempting in the virtualization world here to virtualize your backup infrastructure, and a couple of customers I've seen actually put it on the same hardware as their production data. So seemed good at the time. I can move and vMotion things around and have some little bit of a high availability in my backup solution. But the unfortunate thing was, in that customer's case, the hardware took everything down. So the very thing that was supposed to save your bacon was actually really part of the grease fire, So we have the backup infrastructure close to our protected workloads. The IRE is firewalled and isolated, and the place where your backup images are being kept is air-gapped. That air gap is important. Some vendors are doing that with port and switch manipulation. I happen to prefer a method, that some of the vendors are using where the IRE will make a call to pull the data into the IRE from the outside. So what that accomplishes is it keeps your firewall from having to open up ports from the external side. We're really locking this thing down, and then at least one copy of the data is going to be landing on that immutable or worm, write once, read many, storage that's, going to hopefully be impenetrable here. And then malware scanning minimally in the IRE and ideally everywhere. Strategic scanning by anomaly, subset of critical workloads, maybe before or absolutely before, the restore activity happens are all real key here. And the other thing you'll see there, those purple boxes are kind of interesting and important too, and kind of a new development, at least for us backup guys. The SOAR and XDR, those are acronyms. SOAR is security orchestration, automation and response, and XDR is extended detection and responses. And you'll see those arrows are pointing into the protected environments, and that's really information and telemetry and orchestration information coming to us, into us. And that's that may be something as simple as, hey, there's a DLL on Windows 2019 that we should look for, fix that. That's there might be we want to increase the backup frequency on that because that thing's vulnerable right now and there's some activity in the marketplace. The other purple box, that SIEM tools, security information and event monitoring. You'll notice the arrows are pointing out, pointing out of those environments. And basically what that is telemetry and data coming from the backup solutions to correlate the event, right? It's going to be really critical when you're post-morteming and you're trying to figure out the blast radius of what happened, is to coordinate all the logging. A lot of the modern tools are doing anomaly detection, so those are going to be key pieces of information that are going to feed your security teams other tools to kind of, again, it's going to take a village here. And obviously some of the benefits of this, IRE and clean room are going to be I always feel there's like that delicate balance between security so tight you can't do anything and security loose stuff that you can easily get things done, including getting bad things done. So the IRE is going to have to lean heavily towards the hyper secure side. Not only are we going to put everything possible in the bad guy's way to slow them down, we're going to make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to change, modify, or delete our backups sitting on that immutable storage. The IRE is going to be safe. It's got to be isolated and segregated. We've talked about that before. Where we can find clean backups and/or in this case, unfortunately, restore infected workloads and work to clean them up. So this is a good point, Heather. And let's skip to the next visual there, because I just wanted to take a minute and really look, under the hood a little bit at the kind of things that teams want to be on the lookout for when exploring a hardened and secure backup and recovery solution. I really like this slide because it really illustrates the layered and comprehensive approach and the multiple disciplines that are required to secure the backup infrastructure. And I'm not going to read this whole to you, and hope that hopefully you'll get the recording, to look at if you want to bring this on to your teams. But it's really this layered approach that starts, everything from hardware security, which, we weren't doing some of these things not but a couple of years ago, to be quite frank and honest with you. The whole restricted access thing, that's where the backup vendors are saying, hey, you're not going to be able to do high-level administrative destructive activities without support holding your hand and without a temporary key to do so. You'll see in some more acronyms here: STIG, FIPS, and MFA and RBAC. That's STIG is a technical Department of Defense standards. So, but before, when you said, hey, we're going to turn on STIG features, it pretty much meant you were neutered and it was going to be impossible to manage the environment because everything was so locked down. Well, the vendors are doing us a huge favor by designing it from the ground up with those features baked in. Okay, FIPS is, when you think of FIPS, think of encryption standards. MFA if you've ever been on a bank site and you're asked to, you get texted a code that these are the kind of things, and we'll find out in one of the other examples that even these things can be overcome. And that's why layering and having multiple layers is going to really be vital and important to keeping the bad guys from getting past your last line of defense. The other thing I like to call out, and I just always find it interesting, is in the gray square there, that compliance clock. When we talk about immutability, we still have to allow data to naturally decay and go away. You make a policy that says, hey, I want to keep a backup image for 30 days. Well, after 30 days, I want to get rid of it. Well, a vector here that can be exploited is somebody getting in and pushing the clock forward or pushing the clock backward, and having some kind of immutable clock is also very important. And then you see, as we're working our way to the right, we're doing malware scanning, anomaly detection, all the things that you're kind of hearing as the buzzwords here in the marketplace. So I'm going to kind of come back a little bit to the core problem at hand here in the case study. We're dealing with infected backups. Recovering workloads and cleaning them is going to be a delicate, iterative, and time-consuming process, and a process that needs to, start with and live in the IRE. You're going to bring your clean room to bear. We need to isolate it. Obviously, if we're recovering an infected, we don't want it getting out of that. So we're going to be with the security teams locking it down and working closely with them, and probably other organizations, quite honestly, because if it got by the security team the first time, what's to say it's not going to get past them, now that I'm trying to recover it again, And in this particular case, and like many we're fighting here, a battle on two fronts, right? There's the ransomware detonated and encrypted a whole bunch of files. So in order to get production back and going, I have to get those files back, and then I've got to find the DLLs or the binaries or whatever code was detonated there, and replace those. So depending on how well and refined your workload and OS deployment tools are, you may be inclined to rebuild the operating system by hand, or a lot of people, I'm seeing some automation around having templates ready. I can't recreate my data, I want to restore it, but I can easily and quickly bring a template back and bring the operating system back, as opposed to getting in there surgically with the security guys to find and fix and pull out and what I'd say curate or restore. So this is kind of as good a place as any, I would say, to just make a few comments about ransomware and malware scanning of backup images, right? Scanning data has been around a long time. Virus scanners have been around for a decade more, right? Scanning backup images is a recent development, and the pace of innovation continues to increase. More and more scanning vendors are coming on board, and as you're looking at your solutions, or if you're looking to replace or update your solution, look for tools that are going to give you options when it comes to scanning engines and integration with these external security tools. And I kind of alluded to it early on, and I just think I personally know of a couple customers are still relying heavily on tape, and honestly, we can't do the things you're trying to do with tape. It's not viable. So this might be the compelling reason to modernize and get on disk-based backups. The market is getting crowded. There's a lot of people doing a lot of cool things and forcing us all to really raise our game. And I'll say one other thing too about ransomware scanning. Because of the nature of our backup storage, because of what we're being asked to do, it's very difficult and resource intensive to scan everything all the time. And we need to be a little bit strategic. I think things are getting better as flash storage starts to find its way in a cost-effective way into the backup storage. We might be able to do a better job of this, but right now, what I'm finding people are doing, what's important is let anomaly detection, an anomaly detection hit trigger a malware scan. Maybe you have, we can't do everything, but you have a subset of very critical workloads that we can, because we do have the performance and we have the time to at least do those every day, all day, and all the time. You're scanning those, so do a subset, and then finally, like anytime we're doing a restore, we should always perform, with the latest tools, with the latest fingerprints. Then, and it might seem obvious, but make sure that your solution, because I've seen this, is you can mark backup images, on immutable storage, saying they're clean because I've scanned them. identify the ones that you haven't scanned, and obviously being able to quarantine the ones that you do find ransomware in. So, and when it comes back to this case, I think something that could help, and I'm starting to see a few vendors in the market here who have early iterations of what I'm calling a curated restore capability. Under certain conditions with certain workloads, they can automate the process of looking for that clean copy of a file in your backup images. It's still going to be time consuming, it's still going to be resource intensive, but maybe a little less manual. So one thing too that just a parting comment on this case, I would say, is it just might be me, but this case study kind of accentuated the big difference between a DR response and a cyber response. I get the sense from talking with some of my customers, especially some of the ones that are, struggling to keep the budgets going, and they're always, stretching. They just think, hey, I've got a DR copy, everything's okay. And I think it's clear in this case right now, this wasn't just a DR. This wasn't just, hey, I'm starting up something or I'm moving the cluster over to another site or another node. This was, I had to get in there. It was an iterative process. The techniques and the disciplines and the tools are very, very different. And just want, maybe this again is a little bit of a wake-up call for folks to, take a closer look back at, what they're doing from a data protection and business continuity standpoint. Boy, I think I went a while on that one.
Yeah, no, it's all great information. Our audience has a lot of good takeaways, lessons learned. But let's dive into our third one here. We'll spend, maybe 10 minutes or so on this next case study. So if you want to take that away.
Sure. So the third case study, this is an interesting case. This was a smaller company. I think a lot of us have worked at startups or smaller firms where, you try to do as much as you can with less. And I think this is a classic case where that doesn't really work all the time. So in this case, we're going to talk about a private equity-backed healthcare-focused SaaS company. They're relatively small. They did about 25 million in ARR, and they got hit with a pretty crippling ransomware attack. In this case, there was no cybersecurity team. The security of the company and its data was solely on the DevOps team, which is not a misstep, but DevOps teams, they're very busy. They're focused on pushing code out the door. They're not really focused on resiliency, incident response, and data protection. And it's no fault of theirs, right? Where we're all asked to do more with less. And unfortunately, in this case, some things went through the cracks. Excuse me. So the outcome of this, and I'm going to walk you through the timeline. The outcome of this was 50% of this SaaS company's data was lost forever, which is, for a company that small, is a massive amount of data. Customers were not happy. They lost, I think the number came out to be about 5 million in losses between reputational damage, customer loss, recovery efforts, and ransomware payment. So I'm going to walk you through the timeline on how this happened. So on day zero, right, the day that everything started happening, customers started reporting latency. There was application latency. Team really didn't dig into it too much. They thought, hey, it'll pass. It's maybe just some network issues. But as the day started to go, the DevOps team started to notice more and more network traffic, which launched an internal investigation. By late evening, the application was completely unavailable. Downtime alerts started triggering, and that's when the investigation really started to kick into high gear. By that night, the first instances of encrypted data were discovered. The DevOps team identified it as a ransomware attack and escalated it up to management to kick off their incident response process. So in the morning of, they made a decision to try to isolate the affected systems and initiated a partial shutdown. Continuous efforts were made to secure backups of unaffected systems. They contacted an external cybersecurity firm to start running forensics and start to get some help, because I think they started to realize at this point they weren't adequately prepared to do the response. On day 4, an official ransomware note was covered. This was, all data was encrypted by this point. They didn't really know who to contact. That's when the note was discovered, and they demanded payment in exchange for the decryption keys. On that day, management deliberated the response. They contacted law enforcement and legal counsel. they went through some negotiations and they tried to lower the overall ransom payment, along with proof that the decryption key worked. After about a day of deliberations, the payment was negotiated, proof of decryption was received. So they paid the ransom, they got the decryption key, and they thought they were well on their way. Right? Unfortunately, in this case, the decryption keys were only about 50% successful. So they weren't able to decrypt all of the lost data, which is a huge problem. And unfortunately, at this point, that data is completely gone. On day 14, they hired external recovery experts and forensics teams to try to salvage any of the lost data, analyze the breach, and see what they can do. Over the next 2 weeks, gradual restoration of the systems were happening through backups. They continued to try to restore from whatever backups they had. They tried to do some different types of recovery techniques. But all in all, when all is said and done, there was about a 50% data loss. And like I said, a pretty impactful financial impact to this company. So the aftermath of this, the total, like I said at the beginning, total loss was estimated about $5 million worth of business, including ransomware payment, recovery services, restoration, and additional security measures. They had to do a public announcement detailing the breach details. Try to mitigate some reputational damage, try to get some level of confidence back into their customers, and try to regain that trust. After 3 months, there was, they tried to invest as much as they can. One of the best things about being a CISO is you always want to go in post-breach because that's when the wallets open up and you can invest any amount of dollars into your cybersecurity program. Unfortunately, it's too late, right? So you really want to be proactive in your investments. You really want to think about it, as a risk mitigation strategy, and you don't want to be reactive. You really want to be proactive and make sure that you've got a proper process in place. The entry point to this attack was, very traditional attack. It was targeted through a phishing scheme. The attackers orchestrated a pretty convincing phishing campaign. They sent emails to the company's, DevOps or IT department. I think in this case it was a fake login portal meant to capture credentials. There's no MFA enabled, unfortunately, and it was pretty easy to get a foothold into their network. Once they're on, once you're on the network, it becomes very difficult to detect unless you have, proper command and control tactics enabled to look for that type of traffic. And by the time they realized anything was going on, unfortunately, it was too late. So like I said, the recovery obviously did not go well. They lost about 50% of their data, which really highlights the need for the 3-2-1 backup strategy. Roger, do you want to touch on the importance of this? What is the 3-2-1 backup strategy? Why is it important, and how could it have helped in the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Christos. Yeah, this one's tough. And when I heard MFA and how that got breached, and that to me is all the important to leverage all the features we can. And let me get to the 3-2-1 backup rule. So whether you realized it or not, we were leveraging 3-2-1 basically means 3 copies of your data on 2 different media, and one of those copies being off-site. Now, the 3 copies include your production copy, okay? So many architectural designs will have one backup copy on-site or near the production workload, like I like to have, and then that second copy be kept at a DR or an off-site location. 2 different types of media. Now, that's a little tougher in today's day and age. Obviously, you're thinking disk and tape. Well, again, what I've said about tape is it's a great offline air-gapped medium, but it suffers from so many issues. It's not efficient, physical security, environmental sensitivity, slow, all those things. It's not the best place. However, we could still achieve a different type of media by getting our backup copies into object storage. That could be on-premise or in the cloud. The public cloud vendors, that's kind of like one of the early first use cases for companies' adoption of cloud. Is like, hey, our backup data, this isn't, we don't have to worry about this. Let's throw it in the cloud and see what it does. So that's a really good use case and a good way to accomplish that different media types. And then one copy off-site. Again, if you're doing something like DR or you're putting stuff in the cloud, that should be checking the box. At least, again, make sure if you're already a cloud, born in the cloud or a hybrid environment, make sure those are in different regions, that they're away, that they're separate, and those credentials are all kept separate. which leads me to, I'm going to go back to the different types of media thing again. An interesting thing that I'm seeing in the marketplace is kind of nice, and a lot of the vendors are doing it, is they're managing cloud storage for you. And the real benefit here, I know it might sound a little counterintuitive, like why should I pay somebody else to do that kind of thing? But think about, if you're in the cloud, your credentials are there, to access your cloud copy. So if the bad guys got your credentials, they likely got and can disrupt and destroy the copy that's in the cloud. Going to a third-party vendor, should insulate you from that. And they may be able to get your credentials, but they're not going to be able to get and change or destroy anything on that third-party vendor. So I think that's a really good way to achieve the 3-2-1. And then it just seems like about every 6 to 12 months, when I'm out Googling and looking for a slide on 3-2-1, that I see the 3-2-1 rule change. And you'll see in the slide that Heather's got there, it's 3-2-1-1-0, right? So 3 copies, just like what we're doing before, 2 storage types of media, 1 offsite, but I thought this is compelling. 1 is offline, air gapped, and then 0 errors, right? So you're seeing the vendors, I think this is good, and sometimes you tend to overlook, I'm doing all these things, but again, if you're not paying close attention to, and hopefully you're starting to see how these best practices would have likely eliminated the data loss, and at a minimum would have slowed down the bad actors. At the end of the day, time is still working against you. The longer the bad guy is there, the better chance you suffer that loss and interruption. When I read this case, and I think there was MFA fatigue, it's like, okay, great, we've got MFA, but it was countermanded. It was, they got past that. So there are other things we can do. You can lock down, they call it whitelisting, so only admins from certain IP addresses can get to and administrate certain, elements of your backup and recovery solution.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but locking down those administrative credentials to your backup systems is so unbelievably critical and often overlooked. Is one of those things that really needs to be on by default 100% of the time. It really does.
Yep. And I didn't mention it, but there's things like quorum, right? So even if somebody got one of the credentials, you don't make important administrative decisions or changes, destructive or otherwise, to the environment without 2 guys out the nuclear keys, or two people, 2 admins and a leadership, somebody who's got to authorize the change. So those are great things that are coming, and you're going to find those as features. And again, I implore you and plead with you, go to your backup teams and make sure they're looking at and leveraging these things. It's easy to overlook. It's easy to just say, I got my backups going, and that's good enough. And these cases, I think, clearly show it's really not good enough. Any other comments on?
Is there any parting words on this success or this case study?
I think we covered everything. I think the one thing to highlight here: have multiple copies. Right? There's really no excuse these days. There's multiple cloud providers. There's multiple storage arrays you can use. I can tell you, I know Veritas for sure. We have the ability to restore to multiple clouds. I'm sorry, to back up to multiple clouds, all on immutable storage. That could have saved this company, a ton of money, a ton of time, and a ton of headache. I can't emphasize, and I can't stress enough how important this strategy is.
Yep, I agree.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. This is excellent information. I know we have a slide here on just some additional resiliency strategies. We don't have necessarily time to cover it. So, just some additional things that maybe weren't touched on because these organization case studies that we covered didn't necessarily need to address it, but certainly some important things here. So if you have questions, certainly feel free to reach out individually. But right now, I just want to go to our audience Q&A. So if you haven't already, please feel free to submit a question. And let's see kind of as these roll in here. Yeah, let's go. Okay, here's a good one. So were these case studies mostly involving on-prem infrastructure? Was it cloud only or hybrid? And then to follow up with that, would anything change when workloads are hosted in the public cloud?
So these, to be perfectly honest, it's very rare that I come across a company these days that's purely on-prem, purely cloud. I think in this case, it was a combination of them all. I think all three of them were hybrid. The last one in particular, the software company, they were a cloud native company. All of their production workloads were in the cloud. You know, they were cloud native. They leveraged as much as they could within that particular cloud. The CPG company was a hybrid. They had a direct connect, you know, connecting those networks back and forth. So the cloud is essentially an extension of their on-prem environment. I'm sorry, what was the second part to that question?
Yep, the question was, would anything change when the workloads are hosted in the public cloud?
No, not really. Look, the public cloud providers, they provide a ton of tooling natively that you can take advantage of, right? Ultimately, though, the strategies remain the same, whether you're on-prem, in the cloud, or in a hybrid model, right? Being prepared, testing, documenting, knowing where your workloads are, you know, implementing the 3-2-1 strategy, whether you're on-prem or in the cloud, I don't think it makes a difference, right? I think the most important piece is knowing where these workloads sit, having the confidence that you know where they are and that you have them backed up properly in multiple locations, and then you can meet your RTOs and RPOs independent of the location and as to where they sit. Roger, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts are a little bit of, I see some customers who are in their early journey to the cloud. It's a little bit of a wild, wild west. You know, they're learning, they're doing great security practices on-prem, but those disciplines are a little different in the cloud. Oops, sorry. You know, a little different in the cloud. So you're going to see workloads spinning up and people aren't doing what they should be doing to protect those things. The other aspect of cloud that I hit a lot is that whole rent versus buy thing. You know, backup and recovery tools and solutions are very resource intensive workloads to run. And that goes for the cloud too. You've got a lot of block storage, you've got, you know, high CPUs, lots of memory and things like that. We're always looking, you architect a little different in the cloud because you want to keep those workload footprints kind of small so that they're affordable, but yet you still got to, you know, balance that with how much data is there versus how much data is, you know, getting shoved to a lower tier or you know, like object storage and stuff like that. So that really kind of the two things is, to me, I see the discipline and also just, you know, some people think like, hey, it's in the cloud, I don't have to worry about it, you know, and especially around things like M365. A lot of people have that misconceived, you know, that presumption that, hey, Microsoft and the cloud vendors are protecting me. Well, they're not. They're just providing availability. You can still, you know, screw up your data, lose it, be exposed, encrypted, all those things. So all the same best practices apply. It's just sometimes how you're applying them. What that implementation
Roger, that's such an important point also, right? There's a big misconception out there that, hey, my data's in the cloud, you know, Microsoft, AWS, GCP, they got it covered. It's not the case, right? You're 100% right. Their job is availability of the service, not protection of your data, right? So when you're architecting in the cloud, you really need to think about that approach and how critical this data is and have the right protections in place.
Yep, it's easy to lose control of because how easy it is to spin things up. Yep.
Great, well, thanks, guys. Yep, here's another one. What group within the organization should own the cyber recovery process? And more importantly, who makes the call to do a recovery?
That's a great question. I think every organization is different, you know, and there's resources to consider. There's a lot of things to consider. I think generally speaking, it's a team effort, right? I think, you know, in most places that I've been, which are, you know, relatively larger organizations, the cybersecurity team or the office of the CISO owns the resiliency project as a whole, right? Meaning they're responsible for maintaining the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of their workloads, but the infrastructure teams, the data protection teams are responsible for executing, right? So there's stakeholders in each of them. What I always like to see is have a council in place, right? Have the right stakeholders in the room, right? Because this impacts everybody. It's going to impact, you know, your security organization. It's going to impact your infrastructure teams, and it's going to impact your application teams. And each of them has different needs, different requirements, and you know, different resiliency requirements, right? So having all three of them in the room with a seat at the table, I think is a good place to start. I think at that point, that's when you build out your RACI matrix, you define your roles and responsibilities. ultimately, I think, the resiliency as a whole should be owned by the security team, but the execution is likely going to be owned by the infrastructure team. The RTOs and the RPOs could be defined by your application teams, by the business. It really depends on the organization. That's the way I look at it.
And I'm just a backup guy, but after sticking my nose in the NIST, cyber resiliency protocols, it was eye-opening, and it pointed me at, sample incident response plans. And you really see, and Christos touched on it, it's a team effort. You're going to have multiple disciplines. Just even declaring disaster recovery outside of cyber recovery, I think a lot of people kind of kvetch and wring their wrists because, like, oh, should we pull the trigger? Should we pull? Should we do this? That's where getting as much information from all the teams, where they're sitting, what their capabilities are, is going to be vital. So I don't know if that's a great answer, but places to look.
Yeah, let's try to get to. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say, let's try to get to one more question here if we can. So let's see. So in the cyber resiliency space, what do you think are the biggest challenges?
Biggest challenges in terms of resiliency, I think it's doing data classification and identification and doing the grunt work to identify what's truly important versus what isn't. I've seen a ton of organizations take the approach where everything is important, which means nothing is important, right? When crunch time comes, when the pressure's on, you really need to think about what's truly critical to get the business operational, not what's a nice to have, right? So thinking about things like your identity platform, getting that up to speed, things like Active Directory, your directory services, your core networking services could be impacted, right? Getting those classified and tiered out and identifying those so that you can do a proper restoration come crunch time goes so unbelievably far, but it's not the most fun work to do, right? I can tell you, I've been on the engineering side. I always wanted to work on the innovative stuff. I never wanted to do the documentation work, right? But come crunch time, that documentation, you better believe, is one of the most important pieces, one of the most important things to recovery. And it's so often overlooked and causes a ton of confusion. I think I don't want to say it's a challenge, but I think doing it is the challenge, right? Getting the right people in the room, aligning on that is probably the most challenging piece.
Yeah, and it totally impacts everything downstream, to be honest with you. You can't make those decisions on the tools, from where I sit. To apathy is the wrong word, but it's just not reaping the benefits of the tool sets that I'm using, right? Again, I check the box. I've got my backups. Maybe I've even got 3 copies, but have I turned on it? Am I looking at orchestration and all those other things? And again, so a lot of times you can't apply, when all you have is hammer, everything looks like a nail. You can't do everything the same way everywhere. And that's, to Christos' point, when you've got that map about, we really got to concentrate on these workloads. These ones we can wait a day or two, whatever that is, to really kind of lay out and get the plan in place. And I just think, again, apathy is the wrong word, but it's the motivation to make it a priority. And when it happens, it's too late, Well,
great. We're getting close to the top of the hour here. So that's all the questions we'll answer at the moment. But before we close, I do want to briefly mention today's webinar sponsor, VAST. VAST provides IT services and cloud management solutions to companies and organizations across the U.S. Their services help businesses reduce costs and simplify the management of their evolving on-premise, hybrid, and multi-cloud environments. VAST is a Veritas Gold partner who deploys, supports, and provides managed services for the complete portfolio of Veritas data management solutions and services. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists, so Christos and Roger. Thank you so much. It was excellent information. Certainly lots to learn and takeaways from each of these case studies. So as I mentioned, a follow-up email will include a link to this presentation. So thanks again, and hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.